Welcome to Mastery Fractional CFO's Punchy podcast, short, impactful podcasts where I speak with business leaders from all walks of life and talk to them about business. I'm your host, Ryan Chenier. I'm the founder and CEO of Mastery Fractional CFO Services. And today I've got with me Purdeep Sangha. Purdeep is a North American leader in business and human performance and advises top board members, CEOs, entrepreneurs around the globe, and a little bit more. So I'm going to let him talk to us about that in his words. Purdeep, tell us about who you are and what you do. Tell us about your business.
Well, in terms of who I am, I'm a husband, I'm a father, I got two little kids, but I'm also an entrepreneur. And one of the things that I realized growing up in family business, so I grew up in an immigrant household. You can say my parents immigrated from India, worked hard, saved, started their own business, and I grew up watching them through that process. I was always fascinated by business, and I was always wondering, how are my parents doing better than other people in the industry, even though they have access to the exact same resources? So that was a big thought in my mind here, and I just, as a young age, I was kind of studying that in terms of a business approach. Fast forward, went to business school, multiple different schools here in Canada and the U.S. Was in the corporate world for 14 years, and then I started my own firms. Aside from our family businesses, I started my own firm that I wanted a single place where a business owner could come and say, "Hey, look, I want to scale or grow my business, but also I want to do it in a way that I have some quality of life and fulfillment as well." Because my background's also in performance and psychology and neuroscience. So I'm very much about human performance. And so I brought those two elements together. We're pretty much the only ones in Canada that do this, where we focus on the business growth, strategy, operations, execution element, but also on the human performance side. So we work with executives, entrepreneurs, business leaders, teams to help them through the business, but also helping them in their personal lives as well, in terms of being better spouses, parents, just being happier in general, having better health. So it's hitting both those sides from a professional level, but also on a personal level as well.
Okay. And so in your family, they had their own business. Is that right? Is that what you?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And you weren't interested in following their footsteps with the same businesses?
Well, so my dad passed away in 2018. So we just naturally inherited what needed to be passed over. My mom decided to run one of the businesses herself with our help for 3 years. But during that time, we also significantly, instead of expanding, which, in hindsight, when I take a look at it, my dad passed in 2018. Right before he passed, the year before, we were taking a look: do we expand more, uh, or do we just kind of contract, or just keep it the same? And my mom didn't want any more headaches. And so my parents lived in Kelowna at that time. My brother lived in Vancouver. I was here in Ontario. And so it really didn't make sense for us to expand the family business in the Okanagan at that particular time, because we weren't there. My parents were getting older. And so we decided not to. But even before that, we were, you could say, active in the business, but not as driving the strategy, because my parents and I, we just had different views in terms of how to grow the business. And
Yeah.
that's pretty standard in family business. We typically, right, the founding generation is less risk tolerant. We had a bigger risk appetite, and so we always kind of butted heads from that perspective. So we decided, hey, look, as long as mom and dad are kind of running the show, we don't really need to do much until they ask.
So you decided to head out on your own and begin your own business. And what's interesting about your business, as you just explained it, is that you get into, what did you call it, neuroscience or neuro-linguistic programming, or what was?
Yeah. So I've been studying neuroscience and performance psychology for close to 30 years.
Okay. Did you have formal education in that, or just an area of interest?
Yeah, no, formal education as well. So I started off in sciences and neuroscience. Performance psychology have taken academically as well. So both of those, both from an academic, practical, but also research perspective, because one of the businesses that I built, we partnered up with 20 different universities and research institutions in Canada and the US. So we had access to 80 PhDs and researchers and so forth through our research, because what we did was, it's always been my fascination, human potential. Like, how do we? Because there was this myth that was started decades ago that we only tap into 10% of our brain power,
Mhm.
or 10% of our brain is actually used. It's not 100% of our brain is actually used, but we don't tap into the full potential. If you take a look at performance psychologists, I'm not a psychologist by trade, they will say that the average person only lives up to about 10% of their potential. So I spent my entire life trying to study this to see how people can actually perform at their highest potential. So the science and psychology behind that.
Yeah, I love that because I'm in line with what you're saying there. I think that fits my beliefs. I've got background in psychology. I took that as my undergraduate degree before I took my MBA degree, and so I understand where you're going with that, and I think it's powerful. I think potentially to combine that with business acumen can really take a business to the next level, or a business leader to that next stage in their development. Who would you say you help the most? Like, what would your ideal client profile be?
Well, I used to do a lot of one-to-ones with CEOs globally, some Fortune 100 CEOs and so forth. I still do that, but our organization, what we focus on is more teams. So it's not like executive coaching. We work with teams. So, for example, there'll be an organization uh, well, I'll give you real life examples. And one of the organizations basically that asked us to work with their executive team, and what we do is we work with them not only as a team but as individuals, right? So here's how I equate it: is we help the individual perform at their highest level, then we can help the team perform at the highest level. A lot of stuff that happens right now is they work with the teams without helping the individuals. So we work with executive teams that have high expectations, so high expectation roles like sales teams, business development teams, project managers, for example, will work with mortgage broker teams, real estate teams. But any organization that is wanting to improve the performance of their team members, but also quality of life at the same time. Organizations that care about the quality of life, because what organizations are realizing right now, especially after COVID, is that holy quote, like if they don't take care of their employees' well-being, then the performance drops. And that's what we've seen collectively across the board in Canada.
And so if there's a team of executives, or if somebody's leading a team of executives and they're wondering about how to bring out the best in their team, how to make sure their team is doing well on a personal level as well as a business level, they would go and you would be able to help them. How would they recognize, like, what would the situation be if I'm a CEO of a company that's got a team like this? What am I looking for to recognize that I could use the help of you and your business?
Well, I'll give you a real example that just happened with us, because one of the things that we were testing out was, is the Canadian market open to this? This is why I built the business in the US and overseas,
Yeah.
because the Canadian market 7, 8 years ago was not open to it, because we're a little bit more risk adverse. We spend less in terms of training and development, personal development. And typically, CEOs believe in spending money on marketing or equipment or technology over their people,
Mhm.
because those are more tangible type of assets where you get potentially, a quantifiable return on investment. But here's a practical example where we were having conversations with this one organization, and we were kind of on the borderline of having them sign up for a pilot project. And they're one of Canada's largest employers. They have 400 project managers across the board, across Canada, and they have over 13,000 employees. So it's a large organization, but this one particular group, they are challenged. The project managers are challenged because they've reached their capacity and they're feeling burnt out. And so their project managers are revenue generators. They're the ones that manage these big client projects. And if they're not working effectively, then the revenue is impacted. And so they're wondering, like, how do we get these people to stay at a high level of performance without burning them out and churning through them? Because that's a cost to the organization.
Yeah.
And one of the things that took us over the finish line of getting this organization signed up is that they just recently had a conversation or a meeting where the CFO said, hey, look, we're looking at the numbers here. Our productivity, if we take a look at per person or average for the organization, has dropped significantly. What is going on with our people? And that's where they said, okay, we really need to take this seriously. So that's a practical example of what to look out for: is productivity, engagement, motivation, drive, those types of things.
Yeah, and that can be very significant with an executive team or a sales team or what have you. And to be able to generate more productivity, more efficiency, more effectiveness, well, that could be worth its weight in gold. What would be your process? I mean, if somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, we're having a challenge here like this," give us a flavor for what the next steps might be.
Well, the first one is just having an open conversation and dialogue, which is what from like if we sat down with someone, we would say what is happening within the organization, because one of the biggest challenges that we see right now is people don't want to say, hey, look, my division or my people are underperforming, or we have an issue here, right? Because it potentially could make them look bad. So we have to have an honest and open conversation. And then what we do is we would go in and do kind of like a high level assessment. And it's not the typical assessment that you think. It's not like personality tests and that kind of stuff. We're really taking a look at the key drivers of performance. And I would say 99.9% of organizations don't take a look at that at a human level. So that's where we come in. We'll take a look at the team and individuals. We'll sit down with the individuals and say, for example, we'll sit down, well, and do more of an in-depth analysis if the organization is open to it. And we will ask questions and have our assessments such as, how are things going in your relationship at home? What about your kids? Your energy levels, your sleep. So we identify all the key factors and then we take a look and say, what's happening? Because someone can show up at work and it looks like everything is great, but at home things are falling apart and that's impacting their performance. So that's why we have to take a look at all aspects, because everything, we are human beings. We're not robots. We're not AI. Everything in our life impacts our performance. So we have to identify what those factors are. So those are the first points. And then we'll take a look and see, are there some key themes? Because one of the biggest things, Ryan, that organizations make, and it's been a fallacy for such a long time, and it's a challenge in organizations because there's been this huge hype of leadership training, thinking that leadership training is going to solve the problem when it comes to productivity and performance, right? What they've done is they've abdicated performance onto leaders, saying it's your responsibility to make sure that your team is performing. Well, ultimately, it's their accountability, but every single person on that team needs to take responsibility and accountability for their own performance. And I can tell you, 9 out of 10 people do not understand or have never been trained on their individual performance. Technically, they have, from a technical skills perspective, or they might have done some emotional intelligence courses or leadership courses, but there are no programs or courses out there when it comes to high performance specific training. And that's what we focus on. So that would be our approach and say, is it a cultural thing? Is it something within the individual and the teams? And then what we do is it's a very specific and customized approach to the organization. Because here's what we do know. And we've been approached a number of times and people have said, because our training is more on the higher end in terms of investment, people have said, why don't you create a generic training program for people or an organization so they can take it and you can reach a bigger audience? And I'm like, no, thanks, because I know generic programs will not make the impact that we're looking to make. And that's why it's a very highly customized approach, because it's just like, it's like two different families. The family across the street is not going to have the same challenges as you will. So whatever program that is has to be customized to them. It's the same thing with organizations. So that's our approach. And then what we do also, and I'll promise I'll be quiet after this, is we work with the strategic leaders to enable them to have the knowledge to support and nurture a high performance culture, systems, and processes. So they understand strategically what they need to do to support the individuals.
So what I'm hearing is it's a complex combination of employment culture, leadership processes, systems to back it all up, but also executive training. Effectively, you're helping executives become better executives within the company culture, which is there to synergize with that improvement on the executive side. Am I overcomplicating it, or is that
No, that's pretty much it. So there's a leadership part,
leadership
right?
part?
That's one aspect. Then
Okay,
there's a cultural part, which the leaders have influence on.
right.
And I would say that's about 40% of the ballgame. The
Okay,
60% is working with the individuals,
I get it. Yeah, yeah.
right? Because especially in today's age with virtual workplaces and working from home, the culture at work, guess what, is not having as much of an impact on that person working from home anymore, right?
Mhm.
That leader has less of an influence. They still have a massive influence. I'm not saying that, but it's less of an influence because they're not around all the time. You're working from home. So what's left? It's how they operate within themselves as human beings, and that's what we train.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true, right? With people working remotely now, you're filling a gap that maybe wasn't even there before as much as it is nowadays, and will be increasingly moving forward, which is interesting. And I can imagine it's pretty powerful too in terms of the results that an organization can get with attention to those kinds of details. So that's fascinating. Help me understand what should somebody, if somebody's thinking about working with you and your team and looking at approaching this, what's the timeline? Like what's your engagement like with the company? Is it ongoing, or is it a project like thing, or what is it?
Yeah, it's typically ongoing, and the reason why is because and this is a mistake a lot of organizations make. They think putting someone through a 2-day workshop is going to help them perform better. Well, guess what? You can give them some knowledge, but that's not how performance works. And here's not the model that we've approached it by, but we've taken a look at what works. For example, this started happening in the sports culture about 10 years ago. If you take a thing, organizations like Seattle, the Seahawks, um, Golden State Warriors, even Toronto Raptors now, they have now brought on sports psychologists and performance psychologists to work with not only the players, but also the organizational leaders so that they can create a culture.
Mhm.
Because they understand that, hey, we can train someone on basketball skills, but does that mean they're going to show up with their mindset better? That's not the case. That's why they have these professionals. That's the kind of similar approach that we have. That gap has always been there in the workplace, but it's people are more open to having this conversation. That's why we were talking about, is the Canadian economy and people, leaders ready for it? The Americans were ready 10 years ago in the business world, saying, hey, look, if if a sports psychologist can take our players and win championships like the Golden State Warriors did, what can they do for our organization, our leaders? So the business environment opened up in Canada or in the US 10 years ago, and we're getting close to that in Canada here now. So that's our approach, and that's what we've modeled it based on. And the whole approach there is, it's not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing thing because players get better. In the business world, people get better. They go up, they excel, they get promoted. But guess what? Life happens to us as well. Things change. People go from being in a relationship to not being in a relationship, to having young kids to older kids that leave the house, which poses a completely different challenge. Practically, for example, we work with leaders. We have one in particular I'm thinking of, on our in our partnership list, or clients, you can say, where she is now an empty nester, and she's trying to figure out, oh, well, what's that impact now? Like, her motivation and drive is different, because before it was to put her kids through education and all that kind of stuff. Now it's different. The kids aren't home, right? They're off doing their own thing. So what's going to keep her driven? What's going to keep her motivated to continue to learn and grow? That's where we kind of come in there.
Yeah, yeah, very interesting. And yeah, when you think about sports, a little bit of an advantage over your competition is all it takes to win a championship. And in business, a little bit of an advantage over where you are now compared to where you could potentially be. That can make all the difference in the world. It's like the difference between water at 99 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing happens, and 100 degrees, it starts to boil, right? So
Yeah.
I
Yep.
see what you're saying. I absolutely do. And I really like that. What size business would want to approach you and have you help them out? I mean, most businesses are relatively small and they might be too small for what you do. Help me and help the listeners or viewers understand what level they need to be at before they should engage with you.
Yeah. Typically, our organization, what we do is, like I said, we work with high expectation roles. So typically, executives, VPs, senior leaders, directors, chiefs, CEOs. So it's not for everybody, but we do work with. So let me just start with that. So organizations that typically have a team of 6 or more individuals that are looking to boost their performance or elevate their performance, that are really, I'm going to say, important to the organization. So whether that's a sales team or an executive team, and they are willing to invest in their performance and their well-being. So that is the biggest thing, because we've worked with businesses that are making, let's just say, $10 million a year,
Mhm.
but they're willing to invest $150,000 in their leadership team a year to get them to improve their business. And then there's organizations that we've talked to that make 150 million or even close, 500, 600 million, that they're like, we don't know if we want to invest in our spend that much in investing in our people or leadership, or we're already putting them through leadership training or other standard training. So it
Right.
really is about mindset. What I do know is that based on our research and our experience, and with technology coming in, because we've had this conversation in Canada in particular around the productivity crisis in Canada, right?
Yeah.
So there's a technology challenge because the US is facing the productivity crisis as well. It's a different level, but we're facing it for a number of different reasons as well. But when technology starts to go on the rise, which it will, AI is changing the game very fast right now.
Mhm.
I was just on a call before this podcast about AI, and it's pretty amazing. And what ends up happening is the technology will continue to rise, but then it'll get to a certain threshold, right? Because it'll be accessible by most people and so forth. What is going to be the competitive advantage? It's going to be people, because not all people perform the same. And what we're seeing right now, regardless of whether it's our business, so let's just take our organization out of it. Every organization should be investing in the well-being of their employees. Why? Because, and EAP programs, first of all, EAP, employee assistance programs, are not good enough because the average usage is between 3 to 10%. It's low.
Yeah, very low.
So what people need to understand, or leaders need to understand, is if my people, because there's a spectrum of someone being burnt out, and in the middle there's proper well-being, and then there's high performance on the other end, right? For someone to be a high performing individual, they need to have proper well-being. You can't skip that. So, and what we're seeing a lot of people in the state of right now, because we did a survey of Canadian employees, a large sample size, 83% were saying that they've been burnt out or on the verge of burnout. We did this last year in 2023. So what that means for organizations is, I want someone to imagine this. If, let's just say, conservatively, 20% of your workforce is feeling burned out, or 20% of your workforce doesn't have effective or proper well-being, what is that doing to the productivity and performance of your business?
Significant.
It's massive. Now, 20% is conservative, but now think about this from a competitive advantage standpoint. Your competitors are feeling the same thing. So if you have 20% across the board, but your competitor doesn't know what to do about it, and they're not investing in their employee well-being, but you are, so that 20% starts to drop to 10 or 15 or 5, you now have a competitive advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And so we firmly believe that well-being is going to be a competitive advantage going forward, because so many people, mental health, burnout is on the rise. It's not it's not declining.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very compelling, actually. I get what you're saying there, and I can see where the value is. Absolutely. Okay. Pradeep, we've reached the point in the show where I'm going to switch it around a little bit. I'm going to get you to go ahead and ask me a question as a fractional CFO about anything that has to do with finance or accounting or business in general, as long as it's got some tie back to finance and accounting.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious. So, and thank you for allowing me to ask this question. In particular, what do you see happening with the Canadian economy now? Obviously, interest rates have gone down. I'm still seeing a huge amount of hesitation for businesses, although I have seen an uptick now in the real estate. Construction has started again in some of the big developments in around my area. They just hit ground about 3 weeks ago, I think, after last interest rate uh, drop. And so, what are you seeing now? And what's your foresight in terms of what's going to happen in 2025 for the Canadian economy?
Well, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that things are going to begin to turn around. I think the interest rates are having an impact. I think that there is money that's starting to move, and there's going to be a lot of spin-off business. At the end of the day, the way I think of it is that people don't like to be depressed for too long, and the economy has been a little bit on the depressing side for a while in Canada, in many sectors, not all. And I think that there's a lot of money that's been building up on the sidelines, and there's a lot of pent up energy. People want to do stuff with their money, and they want to do stuff with their energy. And now that things are starting to look a little bit better, I expect that they're going to continue to get better. And as this whole thing gains momentum, it's going to be a big shift. I would expect a big shift by the end of 2025. And I'm going out on a limb here. It may not happen. There's a lot of things that could prevent it from happening. But good markets last generally 5 to 7 years, maybe more, maybe less. But bad markets last 1 to 2 years, typically on average over time. And we've been in that kind of a cycle for a while now. And I think that it is time for things to turn around. People are going to start to to spend a little bit more on real estate. They're going to start to spend more on construction, and then that's going to mean more money spent on transportation and all of these businesses that support each other. As more money is being spent, wages will start to go up. People will go to restaurants, they'll tip more. Waiters and waitresses are going to be able to spend more money in the community, and this is all going to have a pretty good impact, I would think. I don't know in which part of Canada it's going to hit first. I don't know how long it's going to take to hit all parts of Canada, or if it will. But I think in general, things are going to be much better. I think that we have a reason to be optimistic. I think that this is what happens in Canada is impacted in a big way on what happens in the United States. Now, there's a big change in the United States, politically speaking, with respect to the government turnover. And so that potentially could impact things. I will say that the markets in the past week have changed substantially since the presidential election. And that may be a temporary blip, but so far it bodes well. I don't have to be optimistic. I just choose to be, because what's the point in not being optimistic? I don't think there is. So that's my answer, Purdeep. But I would say this, that with careful planning, if you're to build your budget for 2025 and you're to think about where you might spend your money, where you might invest your money, what you might do with your money, I think it's a good time to invest in scaling a business and growing a business. I think it's a good time to invest in services like yours. If you're looking to grow, there is a lot of potential to grow right now. You want to start budgeting for it right now. And you can hold off a little bit maybe and wait, but put the money in your budget to invest in growth, because I think that things are going to get better fast. That's my prediction. I was wrong once before, but that's where I stand right now.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I like that. I like the optimism, and I do hope that things start to go on the rise. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
What's your prediction, Purdeep?
Okay, so I know we want to stay away from the politics, but this is the interesting part. I think because of declining interest rates, I think we're at an interesting time, because real estate, we are pretty much tapped in terms of people being able to afford homes. I don't think people can afford an increase in home prices. So that will be interesting, because we're heavily weighted on real estate in Canada.
Yes.
So what happens there is still up in the air. I'm not sure. And then the political, because I think what we've seen over the last number of years, and the reason why I can share this is because we've seen this in the workforce. We've done research in these areas. People are feeling more depressed, more anxious because of political divide. And we're seeing this in Canada too. Like the conflict, people are just tired of it and they're exhausted, and a whole bunch of misinformation. That has an impact on people's drive and productivity. And if my hope is that we can get past that. I think if we can get unified, have just a collective level, you're talking about optimism in business, just optimism in life for people, I think is very important for performance and productivity for organizations. If we can get that up, then I think we have some great opportunities and some light ahead. I think if people stay depressed and there's this constant conflict, I think we're going to be challenged still.
Okay. Yeah. And it's hard to say what's going to happen for sure, but let's stay on the optimistic side. I think. Yeah. Okay. All right. So Purdeep, what's the best way for somebody to reach out to you, to get a hold of you? Should they be going to your LinkedIn profile or your website? Tell us the best ways to coordinate with you and your team and your business.
Yeah. The best way is you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and it's Purdeep Sangha, or you can connect with, reach out to my team and they'll forward it on to me, which is team@Sangha, SANGHAX, just the letter X.com.
Okay, excellent. Well, to our viewers at home, whoever's watching or listening to the podcast, if you've enjoyed anything on this podcast, forward it to somebody else another business person or an aspiring business person, and see if you can enrich their lives with this. We'd be happy to be a part of that. And other than that, Purdeep, was there anything else you'd like to share today?
No, that was great. Thank you. I appreciate the great conversation.
Yeah, me as well. I really enjoyed that. So thank you for being a guest on our podcast. Thanks for joining us. And everybody, thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. Goodbye all.